So now we're here to talk about growth. We know that as we're talking about mobility, we're talking about development, and we're talking about growth, these things look very different than what we're seeing in a lot of our big metro centers like Boston. And so we want to talk about what type of strategies we need to be thinking about to ensure, like we were talking about in the last panel, that people aren't just thinking about our gateway cities as bedroom communities or suburbs of Boston. We know that our gateway cities are cities, that they have the tools and the assets to be the regional hubs that our state needs to make sure that we're equitably distributing job opportunities, housing, education opportunities, life services across our state. But right now, if our policies are supporting all of the job growth in the Boston metro area, then it's not going to do anything to help with our transportation issues, and it's not going to do anything to help with our housing issues. So let's talk a little bit more about what we can be doing to help our gateway cities grow equitably so that we can actually put more jobs in those communities. So I'm gonna have each of our panelists introduce themselves and give us a couple of minutes about kind of what their role has been in growth across the state and in our gateway cities. And how about we start down here on the end with Ramon?
Thank you so much. Everybody can hear me? Oh, good. Thank you so much, Mass Inc., for the invitation. I am a professor at Clark University, and a very unconventional professor because I, in some ways, spend much less time in my classroom than I spend outside of the classroom. So I take a very aggressive approach to engage students in practice. I mostly teach graduate students. My vantage point these days, that it means where do I pick up what I learn. So I sit in the board of local CDC, Worcester Common Ground, which went through some years of difficulty, but now we're back. We just received the largest project allocation to rebuild the the former medical supply building with some 30 units of affordable housing and several commercial spaces. I also serve in the board of directors of the Massachusetts Endowment for the Humanities, also of the Latino Education Institute at Worcester State, and recently also in the Farm to Institution New England. In addition, I just became the founder of a foundation in Puerto Rico, Fundación Bucarabón, which will be devoting itself to support women's workforce development in the Highlands. So I pretty much don't sleep very much these days.
Okay. Thank you, Ramon. Karen?
Hi, I'm Karen Kelleher. I'm the Executive Director of LISC Boston. LISC stands for Local Initiative Support Corporation. You're still not going to remember that. We're a large community development organization, one of the largest in the country, but we have very, very deep local roots. And so we've been working in Massachusetts for over 35 years. And although our name is LISC Boston, because that's where our office is, and initially that was the focus of our work, we are statewide. And our work is to really aggregate public and private resources to help communities thrive, particularly low-income communities. We also work to build capacity in those communities to do that work, and we work very closely with community development corporations around the state. And then we also do a lot of economic development work where we both fund workforce development programs, career opportunity programs that lead to living wages and growth trajectories for people's careers, and we work with entrepreneurs and growing businesses to try to create opportunities for them to grow. My history is mostly in housing, so I'm going to ask you to all do politely cough a lot if I go off into a housing thing, because this panel is about economic development. And I don't know if you want to get a little bit into the topic.
Maybe let's let Himanshu kind of introduce himself,
Okay.
and then we'll kind of
The last thing I guess I would say is that we've been spending a fair amount of time trying to figure out if there's there in opportunity zones, and if Chris's optimism can be realized in Massachusetts.
Excellent.
My name is Himanshu Bhatnagar. I'm an immigrant. I came to the US 35 years ago to Lowell, a gateway city. And from there, we built a very incredible immigrant story of how not only did we build a business, but also we have helped grow about 400 small businesses in Massachusetts. and the area has been in the transportation. So we built in a sleepy town called Fitchburg, no offense. We started off with about 1,200 trips a day. Today we process about 22,000 trips a day. We cover about 75% of all transportation, subsidized transportation from Fitchburg call center, employing close to 300 transportation companies doing the business. Not only did we help them get business, but also we broke the stranglehold of few companies who would get long-term transportation contracts and would not let anybody else get in. And we created the concept of open enrollment. We helped them with financing of the vehicles. We helped them in creating a cash flow situation where they would get 90%, then 85%, 65%, and 35% of their bills up front before the diligence was done. This allowed us to build a thriving community of transportation, a lot of them being immigrants. And if you will look at the story of gateway cities, it is basically a first thing to do when you land into the US is to understand what you do next. And one of the things that you do is you become a transportation company. And that's our story.
Thank you. Well, I think that we touched on a couple of things, but I really want to talk about two key areas. Number one, what should economic development strategies be for some of our smaller cities across the state, given that they might not have the assets and resources that major metropolitan areas have. And a lot of times, economic development strategies are either built for big cities or rural areas. And we need to start thinking a little bit more about our intermediary cities. But also want to talk about workforce development and small business development. So I don't even know who to start with. So how about why don't we have just one of you kind of jump in and kind of start with kind of what are some of your ideas for what our gateway cities could be thinking about because not everybody can be the next Kendall Square, and not everyone can have a biotech center. And so, how should we really be thinking about our gateway cities and what some of our economic development approaches should be?
Well, let's take a stab at it. I'd like to start a little bit with what's on the ground. Mm-hmm. Right? We sometimes jump too quickly to say what's working, what's not working. What's on the ground? Well, we see a series of district-driven initiatives, some of them rather narrow, whose results are yet to be seen, and some of them are not faring as well as they were projected to do. So, we have casinos, we have large-scale sport facilities, and we have highly compact entertainment districts that are not necessarily the most inclusive. So we have a bunch of those on the ground deployed through a series of gateway cities. We have a series of other policy drives that tend to be a little bit much broader. The TDI initiative is one of those. Working cities from the Fed is another effort at trying to engage various populations from the bottom up in gateway cities. And then we have, I think, a series of other fundamental instruments on the ground trying to sort of change the dynamics of land use and resource utilization. Those ones, the 40D, 43R, changes in opportunity zones, and in some cases a variety of CBDG standard tools that are being used, CBDR also for those ones who qualify for disaster reconstruction and mitigation, and the opportunity zones, which are, as we sort of heard at the beginning, being deployed in a variety of creative ways. So it's a difficult instrument to handle and to manage, not only just the old tax credits, also the new tax credits are often difficult for small community-based organizations to handle. So I think the role of financial intermediation is critical, sort of engaging creatively in development finance through partnerships. So I think we need to take a look at those instruments. I have been taking a look at what it's been said. I was highly uncomfortable with some of the reports I read. They read more like brochures rather than, critical policy analytic, assessments of what's been going on. Very loose claims that are difficult to really test empirically. So I think I would be, very emphatic in that what we need to really is to take a look at the use of those instruments, trying to, clean them up from the spin and often triumphalism that really claims things that are not taking place. And my vantage point is sort of really doing a lot of community work. And in addition, I'm also a resident. I walk here, by the way. I live downtown. I don't live in the rich part of downtown. My son always tells me, why do we live where we live? And I always tell him, well, I like to live where I work, and I work with distressed communities, so I live in the distressed community. So I think I'm, my job is to really, expand the eyepiece and have people sort of look beyond just what the specific focus is. So I think we got a lot of instruments out there. I think we need to do a better job scrutinizing what they're doing and how they're functioning.
So I was going to ask Himanshu, kind of, given the number of businesses that you have helped to kind of foster, have you been leveraging some of these tools to kind of in that process? Kind of what's the path forward look like for kind of starting all these businesses?
Well, we leverage everything that we can find. And
True entrepreneur.
And the argument is that there is so much opportunity available and so little is known to people who live in gateway cities. We make it our job to make sure that we make it available in some simple possible manner so that people can use it. But I'll give you a slightly different angle because I'm a technologist and not somebody who works in the city or for the city or anything. But what we want to do in gateway cities and what we have done is, which is what I think I want to bring to this is, we want to create the concept of opportunity creation. If we want to address the issue of job growth in the gateway cities, there have to be opportunities for people to live and work there. And how do you do the opportunity creation is what has been the focus of our company. The second part is, which is very critical, is human capital development. We do not focus on intellectual capital development. Yes, financial capital becomes easy, but I'll give you a small quip. Facebook is not a factory. It's a concept. It is intellect. That basically allowed them to become, several $100 billion company. So why is it that we cannot launch conceptual ideas in the form of employment-generating businesses in gateway cities? And that's because we don't want to look at gateway cities as an opportunity zone or an opportunity creation area. Yet, you have the largest academic population available in these cities, which means you have student population, you have brains who want to do things. You have all kinds of government instruments available to help these people to create. So one of the things we are now moving into the next generation is to help people in different gateway cities, starting with one, and I'm not going to name that today, to create transportation technology incubators. So you graduate from building a transportation company into creating a transportation technology of the future, whether it is advanced battery systems, whether it is autonomous vehicles, whether it is hybrid fuel cell vehicles. But how do you create new types of technologies? And you have students, you have workforce, you have transportation, you have train stations. There is no shortage of people and opportunity that we can create. So my angle about job growth in the gateway cities is we create opportunity and focus on human capital development.
So Karen, I know that LISC has a lot of tools and has been doing a lot of this work in communities across the country, but kind of what's happening here in Massachusetts and what can we be leveraging to?
I think we need to think bigger, right? This is an innovation institute, and the way we're going to innovate, can you guys hear me? Yeah. Is by thinking bigger and taking the problems that we're solving on a city by city, street by street, neighborhood by neighborhood basis, and trying to create tools that we can deploy across the gateway cities or even more broadly across our communities in Massachusetts. And we do have very different communities. And I actually want to encourage you not to feel so bad about someone who just lives in a gateway city and works in Greater Boston, because they're going to start focusing on the gateway city where they live. And bridging the gap between Metro Boston and these regional economies is actually what will, I think, make us a stronger Commonwealth. And so getting more shared investment in how we solve these really existential problems that we're tackling today, from climate, transit, housing affordability, with a little bit today, and economic development. These are really existential problems that we're solving. We have 351 communities, and a lot of the power that we have to solve these problems lies with those individual communities. We have very little regional power. So a Gateway City coalition that you have and that Mass Inc. has worked with so many of you to build is powerful. And I would love to take Chris's challenge to build a Gateway City TOD fund or a Gateway City mixed-use development fund, where we look at what makes the development we're trying to make happen, look at what makes it hard, and then build the solution into the product and marry it with, you're going to need subsidy, right? It's just what makes opportunity zones difficult to deploy in the communities where we need them is that it attracts investors who are looking for market rate returns. And if you had deals that were feasible with market rate returns in your community, you would not need the opportunity zone incentive, excuse me. So, for example, the TOD fund that Mickey talked about takes low-cost capital from foundations, marries it with some public money that is used to manage risk, and we're able to finance not just the acquisition of the building, which happens to be for housing, but you could use the same tool in an economic development strategy, but we'll finance up to 120% of the acquisition value because we're managing that risk. So we're actually taking more risk than we have collateral to be able to make that happen. You could do that with a mixed use development, for example. And in fact, LISC has a Healthy Futures Fund where we've combined new markets tax credits, which are a subsidy for economic development, with financing for health centers, and braiding different kinds of subsidy together to be able to incentivize the kind of things you'd like to make happen, and bringing in your anchor institutions. And I firmly believe that the business community needs to participate more in these solutions, and that we need to bring them to the table in creating these solutions so that we start to create a shared vision of where we're trying to go.
Well, as we talk about economic development and creating inclusive economies, especially in our gateway cities, I think about after the luncheon event, there's going to be a walking tour of Worcester, Maine South, where it's a TDI district, where they are actually piloting a program around opportunity zones that allows for businesses that have been in that community for decades to now purchase the property or do a rent-to-own program for the property in which they sit. And so this is kind of a creative way to kind of think about how we can use some of our tools. But the real challenge with opportunity zones is you can't do debt financing. It has to be equity investment in organizations. And if you have outside investors coming in and investing, then what that does is that takes away the ownership from the local community. So what are some ways we can kind of think about really capitalizing on like what's happening in Worcester, Maine South, of kind of like almost like this, you're using this as a rent-to-own program, commercial rent-to-own program. I mean, what are some of the things, and kind of given your experience as well, Himanshu, as well as some of the research you've been doing, Ramon, kind of, what are some of the things that we need to be getting, thinking bigger, as you say, Karen, and getting creative?
I think we need to keep an eye on three things and in terms of whatever we do. Number one, I think there is a serious representation gap. We're talking about partnerships, we're talking about bringing people to the table, we're talking about extensive and deep conversations, but in the last Worcester election, 17% of the elected voters went to vote for the city council. I think Mass Inc. recently produced a very clear picture of the representation gap that is taking place. So I think we need to, find mechanisms that, together with the investment, that together with the conversations about partnerships, also help to leverage, resources from communities. And the resources community have is participation. That's number one. Number two, human capital formation. And I'm not saying training and workforce development. I'm talking human capital formation, which includes quality of life, which includes health, which includes making special provisions to incorporate populations that have been traditionally excluded, specifically through, looking through the gender lens here. Large numbers of single households and with children. So I think we need to make a very, very serious and very strong push for human capital formation investments. And the third one, I think we need to begin doing much better in understanding how climate change pressures are going to percolate down to the gateway cities. It is now at the gate door of the states. I mean, we're seeing gigantic confrontations between the federal government and states with respect to manage, climate change. We're seeing it on the fires, we see it on the flooding, we're seeing it on a series of other fronts that will be very important and will start percolating. I think you mentioned of, how the MBTA crashed with the winter. Well, winters are going to be more severe, and summers are going to be more severe. So energy expenditure is going to go up. So we need to really, I think, be more aggressive with respect to the instruments that we're going to design and how they connect the various actors that are involved in the process.
I'd like to add a word to this dialogue, and the word is synthesis. And what it means is that there are so many things available all around you, whether it is technology, whether it is investments, whether it is government support, whether it is community participation, whether it is educational institutions, whether it is private companies becoming a partner, whether it is private capital funds, investment firms. It's very challenging to synthesize all of them to create something that can actually produce for a long time. It's very easy to say, I'm going to set up a residential apartment complex in an area, I need funds. Yes, and it's pretty standard. If you have to create real estate, can you create the real estate so it produces enormous amounts of wealth, not just the rental income? And that level of thinking requires you to understand what has to go into these real estate in terms of the businesses. And if we can do that, there is a lot of opportunity for these gateway cities to become the new hubs in the state. And the one we are talking about, we are looking to make that into a hub, which can generate enormous amounts of business from the gateway city alone, so that all the people in the suburb, instead of going to Boston, go there.
Yes. So I've gotten the notice that we're out of time, but Karen, I'm going to give you the closing word before we go to our Q&A session.
I don't know that I have any thoughts worthy of closing. It's hard work, but I think that coming together after we have a conversation like this to say, okay, let's go and figure out what is that synthesis and how do we get into a laboratory together and bring the stakeholders into the room and do the problem solving, because we're all going to go away from this conversation hopefully a little bit inspired to do that work, but we're going to have to do it together to achieve that synthesis. So I hope we can find some ways to do that together.
Excellent. Well, on that note, I'm going to give everyone like 2 minutes as we bring all of our panelists and our keynote speaker up to the front. We're going to have a seat and actually take some of your questions, because I know that as we've talked about mobility, development, and growth, they're very broad topics, but they're all interconnected. And so I wanted to give all of our panelists an opportunity to answer those questions together, because as we're sitting here talking about economic development, I'm thinking about, well, yeah, but what role does transportation play in that? And of course, housing and development plays a huge role in what can and can't be done in terms of economic development in our communities. So let's take a 2-minute break. Do we have 2 minutes?
11:22.
All right, we're doing good. So let's actually take an 8-minute break.
Oh,
And so